or an informal garden. And that's a lot of what we do, is that type of garden. Um, and for most of these things, as it says at the bottom, plants are the answer for the air and the water and the trees and the gardens. The the gardening conditions drive, the conditions of the setting drive a lot of what we do. And so here's some descriptors of what we have in mountain lakes. Our soil in general is not too bad. It's gravelly, sandy, loam, so it drains pretty well. But in a lot of places that are undisturbed, there's this thing called a fragipan layer, which is just a cemented layer of soil, and it's down 18 to 24 inches, around 20 inches, and that stops the water from draining. So we have a lot of places, a lot of yards, there's a wet spot in the yard, and that's what we can attribute it to. With all the oak trees, we have acidic soil, and for anybody who has dug, there are many rocks that you will encounter. Topography, flat to slope to very steep slopes. And again, because of the trees, we have lots of shade. Pretty healthy amount of precipitation, about 50 inches a year. That includes the snow melt. Temperatures. This is really critical in terms of selecting your plants. The average temperature can go down just below 0 Fahrenheit. And the US Department of Agriculture divides the country into zones for plant hardiness, and that drives a lot of our selection of plants. We're in 6B. And then on the other side, there's a heat index. And this is the American Horticultural Society sets these. It's how many days are above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees centigrade. So we have 30 to 45 is the range we fit into. So with some of the questions, how do I make sure my plants will do well? And it's these same general things, but you have to pick your plants for the specific location, not just the general mountain lakes. The way these hardiness zones work is the numbers start in the north and go to the south. So we're in 6B, and just to our north is 6A, and then 5 and 4. So anything that has a number lower than 6B is hardy, and when you go to the garden center, you can buy that, and that'll work out fine. The heat zones are a whole lot less useful because the growers who pot up the plants don't usually report that. It's important though. There was a garden, a riparian buffer that was put on at the Cove on Mountain Lake on Morris Avenue for our centennial. And there was a plant, it's called a sweet fern, that did perfectly fine for hardiness, but it didn't handle the heat of the summer at all. So each year we lost more and more of it. I don't know if there's any of it left. The most obvious characteristic that I think most people understand is that plants need different amounts of light. So anywhere from full sun to shade, and then in between partial sunshade. Water and drainage are linked, but they're not quite the same. Most plants need water, and the typical plant, I would say, in our gardens, they need plenty of water and plenty of drainage. So you start talking about drought tolerance and whether they can grow in a wetland or an upland. Soil pH, the acidity or alkalinity affects which plants. All plants need nutrients. That doesn't necessarily drive the plant, but it may drive how you care for the plant. The oxygen, even though they photosynthesize and make oxygen, they need oxygen in their roots. And then air movement. Some need space and some need shelter. So, and then we put an awful lot of salt on our roads in the winter. So if you have a garden near the road, that can be be an issue. At this time of year, this is a very frequent question. When can I put out my plants? And it's all tied to your freeze dates. It's reported by probability. So on April 25th, you can be pretty sure that there's a good chance of having a freeze date after that. Today's May 6th, so this is the day when you go to the garden center, they'll say, okay, you're fine for putting out your plants. But that just means that half the time on that year, you would still have a freeze date coming at night, and half the years you would not. I've looked in the next 14 days, and it looks like we're probably free of freezing at this point. The lowest I saw was 38, which is a couple days away. But by the time you get to May 18th, you're pretty sure you're not going to have any more freezing temperatures. So for this year, we're in pretty good shape. Remember that you can have frost even if it's above freezing, if it's a clear night and it's a cool night. The tropical plants are another issue. If you put out tropical plants that you get at the garden center, or if you have house plants, nighttime temperatures really should be reliably above 50 or 55 for them to survive. Hard freeze of 28 is really only relevant. It's most relevant related to vegetables and that type of thing. There's some that can handle lower temperatures and some that can't. So, but we're past those dates for this year. So, before you put out your vegetables, you might want to check those in future years. This is the challenge in Mountain Lakes. How can I build a shady garden? It probably comes up the most because somebody has a sunny garden and then start planting some of those in the shade, and they don't work particularly well. And the other corollary to this is the question of what can I get to bloom in my shady garden later in the summer? So when you build your shady garden, you should start with some shrubs. And there's a number of them. Most of them bloom relatively early. Hydrangea on the top row, you have hydrangea, you have rhododendron. In the middle on the top is a leatherleaf viburnum. There's a dozen or so different viburnums. This one in particular is blooming now. It's right out in front of the library. The one on the right is a cherry laurel. That's more of a lower plant. That's a pretty large specimen there. That's also at the library. The ones on the left lower are azaleas. Middle bottom are oak leaf hydrangeas, and they tend to bloom a little bit later. And there's several varieties of hydrangeas also. And then there's a mountain laurel on the bottom right. A couple other shrubs that grow in the shade. There's something called pyrrhus. It's also an broadleaf evergreen, a cuba, and then there's a needled evergreen. A yews will grow in the shade pretty well. So then this is where we get into the difficulty. Is a lot of gardeners in Mountain Lakes like to focus on perennials, and there's quite a few perennials that will grow in the shade, but many of them are in the spring. In fact, they have a term for them. They're spring ephemerals because they're fleeting. They bloom before the leaves on the trees come out, and then the flowers go away. And as the summer approaches, so do the leaves and the plants, and they disappear till the next year. So there's lots of spring flowers to put in the shades, but the list of summer flowers is fairly short. And so a lot of people put in astilbes and hostas. And then it's like, what do we do? And so you have to depend on things that are not necessarily the flowers. The ferns, there's a whole variety of ferns that can add some texture and height and variety. And even the hostas have some different color leaves that are a good interest in your shady garden. The plant that on the right that has the big leaves and the yellow um, petals, that every year people stop by and say, "What's this plant?" Because it's one of the shady plants that grows later in the summer. It's called ragwort or ligularia. Um, okay, so even if you depend on perennials for your sunny garden, you will probably need to put in some annuals for your shady garden. You can use them for color. One of the advantages of annuals is that they bloom repeatedly. Um, and and so they really are you can put them either in a container or in the ground. There's several examples: begonias and impatiens, and that includes New Guinea impatiens. There's a lot of varieties of begonias. They seem to be the staple for annuals in the gardens. The three C's that are there, um, Caladium, Coleus, and Croton, all are put in for their foliage rather than for their flowers. Putting in container gardens add interest. All of these are Sue Marshall's designs. And one of her secrets, she tells me I'm not supposed to tell this, but is that she likes to use houseplants in her containers, and they work well in the shady garden. On the left is a canna lily and million bells. In the center is a shrimp plant. At the top, there's the croton and asparagus fern. And on the right is a begonia, Boston fern, and then licorice plant. So how does it all come together? Here's an example of a shady garden. It has some shrubs and some perennials with different colored leaves. And it's supported by some begonias and impatiens, both in the ground and in the pots. There's an example of a shady garden. One other thing about light, and it really is important about making sure you have the plants that are tolerant to the condition. The two upper left pictures are both redbud trees that are at the cove. When redbuds grow naturally, they are in a open woodlands. And so when they're out in the bright sun, they don't do well. They're blooming now very nicely, but every year it takes work to prune back the leafy material, the crown of the tree, to make sure that there's plenty of roots to support the leaves, because the middle picture, you can see the curl on the leaves. Even when it's been raining a lot, the sun is just too much for the leaves. And we have an awful lot in town of redbuds. They're a beautiful tree, but they're put in the sun way too much. The bottom left picture might look like it needs its light adjusted, but those hosta leaves, which grow in the shade, they're all in the sun and they're burned up. One of my pet peeves is putting hostas, which grow in the shade, next to roses, which is the picture on the right, and you can see the flowers at the top. Roses to bloom need about 6 hours of direct sun a day. So when they go side by side, either the roses won't bloom if they're in the shade, or the hostas will burn up if they're in the sun. As we keep going through some of the conditions to make sure you have the right plants for the right place. The picture on the left has a couple hostas down at the bottom. They like alkaline soils, and right above them is a pair of hydrangeas that like more acidic soil. and lots of water. And behind them are some rhododendrons that like um, some water, but they really require drainage. The joke about rhododendrons is they won't survive unless you follow the first 7 rules, and all of them are good drainage. So those sets of plants that are there, um, are put in, but it seems like without thinking about the conditions. On the right side, um, the the plant kind of on the left side with the small pinkish white flowers, that's a sweet pepper bush, and they grow in the lowlands. And then the yellow flower is a St. John's wort that grows only in the uplands, and they're side by side again. Remember the fragipan that I mentioned early? That's the cemented layer that's down about 20 inches in a lot of people's yards. Um, Sometimes, unless you're going to break up that layer, it's useful to just put in some plants that do well above it. And here are a list of some plants that we like. They're all native plants. We put these in our rain gardens that we build, and they all bloom nicely, and some of them get some berries that attract some birds later. The pH is also a condition that and this one probably is overlooked a lot. On the left, there's a remnant of a little shrub that was an azalea, and they like very acidic soils. And the homeowner here had refaced their foundation, and so the cement raised the pH, and the azaleas just couldn't take it. And so what we did is we had them replace the azaleas in the shade with hostas, which like higher pH, like the alkaline soil, and they also do well in the same light conditions. A lot of most plants tend to like acidic soil, or slightly acidic soil, or neutral. There's some listed here that are fairly common that really like alkaline soils. I mean, you'll see hosta on the list, and some of the hardy begonias and peonies, Rose of Sharon, all of which are common in our town. This isn't really much of a problem, because it's pretty easy to solve. If you put crushed limestone on it, the same material that you put on your lawn, it will raise the pH, and if you put it down right before you mulch it, then it'll help, and it won't burn the flowers or the plants or anything. So it's a pretty easy thing to solve, but it's important to kind of understand that that's an issue. So how can I get more from my garden? When I'm looking at a garden, I tend to take a holistic approach. And for those of you who aren't aware, we have 2 rain gardens in town, one at St. Peter's Church and another one right before you get to the parking lot at Birchwood Lake. And we've won awards for both of those in the last 2 years. And partly because of the project, but partly because we defined what a rain garden really ought to do that hasn't been done before. And so a basic rain garden is a small depression that's then planted. The depression holds the water and allows it to infiltrate into the ground. The garden is planted there to help that infiltration, and also to soak up some of the water and the nutrients. But rain gardens historically have really not been very attractive. And so one of the points that we've made is, if you're going to make it a garden, if you're going to call it a garden, you might as well make it look nice like a garden. And the other thing that's standard in a rain garden is they put in native plants, because they tend to have deep roots and they help the infiltration. But a lot of them are not coordinated in a way that they actually create a habitat. So So one of our messages on the rain gardens is, if you're going to put in a rain garden, let's do the whole thing and get the most out of it. So from tonight's point of view, where we're talking about a garden, we could flip that thought, and if we're going to put in a garden anyway, um, why not water it with water that's coming in a downspout from your roof, or um, or if we're going to put in native plants, let's create a habitat while we're at it. So we tend to do an awful lot of habitat gardens. That's not necessary for anybody else who wants to garden. Monarchs are really quite in peril around the country, and so we have a lot that we can do here in Mountain Lakes with monarch butterflies. The caterpillars only eat milkweeds. So the wild, the field milkweeds, and then this orange one on the left is called a butterfly flower or butterfly weed. And there are people who set up these programs to collect the caterpillars, raise them, let the chrysalis go, and then they turn into a butterfly. But I'm not sure why the answer isn't just to plant more milkweeds, because they grow very well here. In addition to the butterfly weed, there's swamp milkweeds, which go nicely in a garden. I really like the picture on the right because we have both a caterpillar and a butterfly together, and that rarely happens because the butterfly lays the eggs, the caterpillars grow and eat the milkweed, and then there's a chrysalis in between. So that's kind of an unusual picture. Another question that is asked of us often is, a flower is done, when should we cut down the stalks? And the normal answer to that is when the flower is done and you don't like what it looks like, you can cut down the stalks. But as soon as we start talking about habitat and wanting to create more milkweeds, there's a balance there, and leaving them to go to seed so that they can spread and we can get more milkweeds. The same goes with you'll see the goldfinch in the middle and the bottom. That's our state bird. It's on a purple coneflower, and we tend to leave those to go because the goldfinches nest later than most birds, right when the purple coneflowers, the echinaceas, go to seed. So we have a couple other examples here. There's a black swallowtail on the left on a phlox, and honeybees on a sedum on the right, and actually quite an unusual butterfly on the impatiens up above. A few years ago, great swallowtails were very, very rare and almost not reported in New Jersey. But we have them here every year, multiple times, and quite a few of them. The picture in the front top is the top center is a robin's nest. I took that picture on Sunday in a shrub on the library property. And I think I live right across the street from the library. So between that and our yard, I think there's probably about half a dozen robin's nests right now with eggs in them. So back to the idea how to get the most out of your garden. A lot of times the discussion is, well, what colors should we put in and how do we maximize the colors? And if you remember, the most important design factor is to have the right plant for the right conditions. The color is just one of the design factors. And you can go a lot further if you start talking about forms and colors and textures and heights. And there's a lot of power in designing your garden if you include a variety of these things. And then there's the seasons. We aim to have something blooming in our yard all the time. And when I say all the time, I mean from January to December. When there's snow underground, that's a little tough. But we've had pansies come back, just leftovers and blooming on New Year's Day. So we have spring on the left with the daffodils and plumbago, and then summer with the purple cone flowers and the bloom flowers. Your seasonal interest doesn't have to be just flowers. The third picture is the colored leaves from an oak leaf hydrangea. And then the plant on the right is the winter berries. The berries, we have several of them planted on the library property, and they will stay like this until the robins eat them, and then they disappear. So this is an amazing topic to me. How should I arrange my plants? Because it seems like the standard, and it's certainly the standard by landscapers, and even what some of the designers get into isn't really getting the most out of your garden. And sometimes I feel like alphabetical might be just as good as what's done. But I suggest that you consider both aesthetics and function. A very typical thing is to have groups of 3, groups of 5. So we have a barberry, 3 barberries, 5 ilexes, 7 coreopsis, and then on the bottom right you have 5 hostas and 5 roses. Again, that don't go together for the sun. So I don't really understand that. I believe the landscapers do this because it's easy to have their workers put them in groups like this without much supervision. And there are some reasons to have a mass planting, which is what it's called when you put all of them kind of together. And if you want to put in a screen or a hedge, you have to put the same kinds of plants in. But it really doesn't do much for you when you just put in a group of the same plant spaced in a group. This is a particularly interesting example because we have rows of plants, and so it's basically a stripe, and so each stripe stops your eye, and it doesn't tie any of the garden together. So you see purple and then white and then pink and then green and then white, and it really doesn't do much for tying your garden together or making it a cohesive garden. So what do you do instead? Really, the right way to do most, especially the cottage gardens, the English gardens, the informal gardens, is to intermix your plants. And if you do that, that means different plants at different times take over the responsibility of moving your eye through the garden and tying it together. So whatever's in bloom, in this case, is kind of in the background. There's these blue, bluish balloon flowers that tie it all together. But at another time of year, it's a different color or a different set of plants that do it. On the right-hand side, which is a little more formal, you still can see we have groups of 3, but the groups of 3 are intermixed with other groups of 3. So they're intertwined, and it makes it one garden, not a whole bunch of little ones. And there's always something happening in the whole garden when you do it this way. So here's another example of the upper right picture was there for years. This is in front of St. Peter's Church, and there's this. It's called lily turf. It's liriope. It's a mass of green, and then there's ivy in there too. And one Friday morning, Sue came to me and says, "I know exactly what to do here." So Friday evening we went. My son and I dug up the whole thing, and by Saturday morning, we took the picture at the bottom. So you can, we put in roses, and we put in a different kind of liriope across the front that clumps, and we put in some lantana, the yellow flowers in there. And there's also some other flowers that are kind of lost in the light. But you can do that very, you can refurbish a garden very quickly if you know what you want to do, and it can change the world, really. We were supervised by a praying mantis the whole time when we were doing it. Another topic that comes up regularly is how do I prune? And this is a topic that's way too big to cover tonight, but when you prune, you need to make sure you have a reason to. There's a lot of plants that don't really ever need pruning. So you need to know if you're taking out a dead branch, if you want to refurbish a plant, whether you need to shape it some way, whether you're trying to make it get more flowers. There's a whole bunch of things. And then the second thing, which is really key, is to understand each plant's essentials. So right now we're in the spring, and there's a lot of shrubs that are blooming. And after they bloom, when they're done blooming, is not a bad time to prune those. But you don't want to prune before they bloom, because you'll cut off buds and they won't bloom. And work with a plant. I always say this is a gardener's version of the carpenter who says measure twice and cut once, because once you cut a branch off of a tree or a shrub, you can't put it back. This embrace natural attributes is lost on a lot of pruners. The tree on the left is a spruce. The tree on the right is a spruce. And I saw that we were headed up to a wedding in New England, and I had to stop the car to take a picture of the spruce that looked like an egg. Okay, so but where should I cut? These are not exactly the same variety, but they're both weeping cherries. And the one on the right was pruned, to look like an umbrella, and it was done by what they call heading cuts. So a heading cut is basically cut on the branch. You just cut off a piece, and here they did an even job, but it's much more the form of the weeping cherry that you're looking for on the left. And when that's pruned, it's done with thinning cuts. And so a thinning cut, you cut back to a branch, you cut off a whole twig or a whole limb back to a larger branch or back to the trunk. And that tends to be healthier for the tree and more in line with their normal growth. And then what pruning tools should I use? The power hedge trimmer on the right is the only times to use that is if you have a hedge that's been there for a long time, like a boxwood hedge or a privet hedge or an ilex hedge. And even if you're trying to cut back and reshape one of those hedges, you really need to do it with a pruner. It's much more of a precision type task than a brute force task. The pruner on the left is a hand one, they call it a clipper. There's a larger versions that are two-handled, usually called loppers. You can cut larger branches. A small handsaw works well, but pruning is not a brute force type of activity. This comes up every single year. Why didn't my hydrangeas bloom? And sometimes it's because you have a warm winter and then a cold snap and it kills the buds. But usually it's because they're not pruned properly. And the first thing to determine is what kind of hydrangeas you have. So the tall ones in the back are called panicle hydrangeas. They're white and they're very tree formed. But when they bloom on what's called new growth. And so there's not really a lot of trouble with them. And there's another shrub like white ball bush. There's a cultivar called Annabelle. So a lot of the white ones that look like these pink ones in the front are fine if you cut them back. You can cut them almost to the ground. But the pink and blue ones are Hydrangea macrophylla. They're sometimes called hortensias, mop heads. There's one with a different shaped flower that's called lace cap. They're all the same, and they bloom on last year's growth. And last year's growth means just all the buds and the stick that it grew last year. And a very common mistake in pruning hydrangeas is to cut farther than that, so they don't have the buds to start where they need to bloom. There are some cultivars of this now that are called Endless Summer, and they have solved a bit of that problem. But in general, if you have pink or blue hydrangeas, and also the oak leaf hydrangeas, if you cut them back too far, they won't bloom. And again, this is related to the power tools. Oh my, what happened here? The one on the left was a very large hedge trimmer that they tried to cut back they tried to rejuvenate the shrub, and it didn't work. And the one on the right is with a blower. They blew the landscaper came, and we didn't know what was going on, but he was shoveling. He was picking up shovels full of dirt off of the parking lot. And it's because he had taken 2.5 inches of dirt out from under this oak leaf hydrangea. You can actually stick your hands underneath this. And the green part of the stem was where their power blower blew the bark off the hydrangea. It's taken us 3 or 4 years to get it. It didn't die, but it took a lot of work to restore this oak leaf hydrangea. Again, power tools have a place, and they're useful, but they have to be used carefully. What's eating my plants? This was a really bad winter for deer, and so the answer for deer, and also rabbits, also is to put deer repellent on them. The deer repellent works for rabbits also. At this time of year, it's very tough because the deer repellent needs to go on top of leaves to stay, and the commercial versions have an additive that makes it adhere to the leaves. But the deer are starting to eat it before all the leaves are out, so that makes it a little bit complicated as when to put it out there. I just planted some more spring plants at the Birchwood Rain Garden, and I was thinking, should I put deer repellent out? But I didn't, because there were no leaves. And then the next day, I went back to water the plants, and the deer had eaten a whole bunch of things. So, okay, so the other question that comes up related to this is, which plants should I put out that the deer won't eat and that they don't like? And the answer is, when the deer are hungry enough, they'll eat almost anything. But Rutgers has a pretty good list of deer resistance of plants rated by deer resistance. So they have ones that are rarely harmed, and they have at the other extreme ones that are regularly affected badly. So the plants that the deer like the most, they like. I don't know if your pictures are over this. There's a tulip on the right. They love those. That tulip has been at the library for years and years and years, and it sometimes blooms and forces its way through. It's always eaten by the deer. Another favorite is of course the hosta, which makes gardening difficult in mountain lakes. They like yews. They like azaleas, arborvitae sometimes, but deer will eat almost anything if they're hungry enough. Invasive tendency, there's a lot of weeds out there, and we're always, as gardeners, fighting weeds. But the invasive species are particularly difficult. There's a New Jersey strike team that has a list of plants not to buy. Mountain Lakes passed a resolution about, I don't know, 6 months ago, with a list of about 30 plants that you should avoid planting. The plant on the left, garlic mustard, is blooming right now, and it's a biennial. So when it's just on the ground, it's hard to pull up, but when it's blooming, it takes all the energy out of the roots and is now in the flower. So it's really easy to pull at this point. What makes it particularly pernicious is that it excretes a chemical. It's called allelopathic, and it will kill other plants around it. So it inhibits their growth, makes it particularly, so it tends to grow into big masses. And the other thing is that because it's biennial, it takes a long time to get it all out of a woodland area or something. The one in the front is the red one is a burning bush. Nobody said that invasive plants aren't beautiful or pretty. They were planted and brought to the United States because of their appearance. The one on the bottom right is barberry. You still can buy both the burning bush and barberry at garden centers. The barberry has another bad habit in that it hosts and encourages deer ticks, which are the source of Lyme disease. So you really should try not to use barberry very much. A plant that has become way more common just in the last few years is this yellow flower at the top. It's called lesser celandine, and it grows in these huge masses. I think they're mostly done blooming now, but I took this picture probably about 2 weeks ago in Mountain Lakes, and it's growing everywhere. It grows along the banks of the streams, but also some of the wide areas. So be careful with chemicals. The big issue with fertilizers is that the phosphorus in them, which is needed for certain things, for flowers to grow and for grass to sprout and other things, is that if you use too much of it, it washes into our lakes and streams, and it causes algal blooms in our lakes. We have an ordinance that in Mountain Lakes, and it's modeled after the state. It says don't use phosphorus on your grass unless you're restoring it. Don't put it on your trees unless you put it in underground. And so that's the caution of it. You can test your soil with the Rutgers Extension Service to see if you need more phosphorus. The big issue with the pesticides is that most of the pesticides and insecticides don't just kill the insects that you're aiming for. So, there's a lot of treatment companies out there for mosquito and tick controls. There are some non-chemical approaches to it, but both the systemic insecticides and the things that they spray will also kill butterflies and ladybugs and honeybees. So, how they're applied is also important. When you talk about lawns and gardens, the weed preventers tend to be less toxic than the weed killers themselves. So Claude Monet said that his garden was his most beautiful masterpiece. And as a master artist, that's saying something. This side, I took a picture of this. It's right outside the library. I encourage you to go to this plant sale. What's great about it is that all the plants are locally grown because they come out of garden club members' yards. So they dig them up, they divide them, they put them in pots, so they're established. So they're pretty good plants. And the best part is that they usually have some people there who can help you pick your plants and make sure you have the right ones for the right conditions. This is just our company, Garden Magic. The main thing we do is work for do-it-yourselfers. We do garden assessments and some advanced design, and spend time training various groups, including landscapers. We're not landscapers, but we train them. We've developed on the bottom right a pretty interesting garden design methodology called Better Garden Design. And we also, with our awards for the rain gardens, have what we call next generation rain gardens, which are above and beyond, I think. So questions, welcome to the gardening season. The email at the bottom is how you can reach me. You can ask questions later. You can ask me for things. Plants are the answer that I had on one of the early slides. I have some bumper stickers for that. If you want one of those, just let me know and I'll figure out a way to get one to you. So with that, Morgan, can we open up for questions, or do I have to stop sharing? Stop sharing.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Well, first, I loved your presentation, and I admire every time I walk by the house over there, perhaps even high. But I recently bought a gorgeous mandevilla to put outside.
Yes.
And the plant that came, I ordered it online, is much larger than I thought. So I put it in a pot. The new pot is only about 2 inches wider than the nursery pot and about the same height. And I had a thing for it to vine up, and it's already 3/4 of the way to the top. So I'm wondering if I should repot it right away, just let it go for the summer.
No, you should let it go. They bloom better when they get pot bound.
Okay, great, because it's the first time I've had one of those, and it's
yeah. So yes, it's fine that you put it in a bigger pot, but I wouldn't do it again.
okay. Okay, it wasn't a lot bigger. So, and then can I bring that inside over the winter?
Yes. Most of the tropical plants you can bring inside. Sometimes they need a little bit different care when they're inside. Sometimes you have to adjust when you fertilize and how much you water, because they can still sometimes go into a dormant type situation because they have a different setup. But you might want to, again, be a little careful. Have you put it out already?
It's been out, and I bring it in when it's cold at night.
Okay, I was going to say, if on a night that goes down into the low 40s or 30s, you might want to bring it in.
Yeah, I've been bringing it in when it gets to.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. What else?
Brian, I have a question.
Okay.
What do you feel about like feeding your plants with mere acid or things like that? And if you are in support of it, what time of year should you do that?
Oh, say that again.
How do you feel about feeding your plants mere acid or Hollytone? And when do you think time of year you should do that? Like in the spring, in the fall, or?
Well, yeah, first of all, that type of fertilizer is good for certain types of plants. I mean, you only use it on acid-loving shrubs and trees, really. I mean, you wouldn't use it as a normal garden fertilizer. I mean, on all your plants, because it tends to be lower. It tends to be more acidic. So it works on that. And when to fertilize, to some degree, it depends on the plant. There's different schedules for different types of plants. But a good time to fertilize those shrubs, if you're talking about putting it on some of your evergreens or things, those grow, they work on their roots over the winter. So a good time to fertilize them is, later in the summer, early fall. A light fertilizing in the spring sometimes can make them go wild too. So, I'm not sure. Partly depends on how much they need of it and all that too. But it does help with the right pH, right acidity, and it does give them the nutrients they need to survive the winter and work on the roots. So, what else? I didn't answer all of your questions, I'm sure.
I have one more. So I'm
Okay.
trying new things this year. I have some moonflowers started, and I
Yes.
thought I'd keep them in pots,
Yes.
but I was wondering about maybe planting them in the backyard, and I think they're annuals.
Yes. They're in the genus Datura, and they're beautiful, but they are annuals. Sometimes they'll reseed themselves, and so you'll get some coming back. They're in the same genus as a native plant called Jimson weed, which yes.
Interesting. Thanks.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any other questions? I feel like I have like 7 more, but
Oh, I have a question. Brian, this is Evie Jaffel. I have a question about cicadas.
Yes.
Is there anything we should be worrying about or paying attention to cicadas?
Do you want to buy some earplugs?
No, I keep reading that they're coming and they're on their way, and I was just kind of curious.
They're coming. They're coming. The interesting thing about 17-year locusts is that each brood stays underground for 17 years, but that doesn't mean that we as humans have to wait 17 years to experience it, because there are different broods. The brood that's coming out this year is brood 10, and they're coming whether we like it or not. But they're not particularly difficult. I mean, you hear about them. People call cicadas locusts, and they think about the biblical locusts that ate everything. These will be all over the place. They'll make lots of noise, but they're not going to be particularly harmful to anything. So there's nothing to do other than to wait till dark when they go to sleep. And then the katydids will be out in the summer. So
I gotcha. But you're not expecting it to have any impact on gardens or anything? Just
no, not really. No.
Okay, thank you.
Oh wait.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi there. We joined a little bit late. Will you be posting your presentation anywhere?
Good question. Morgan, are we posting this?
yes, we are recording it and it will be on the library website.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And we also have a question. We just moved to the area. Is there a good time to plant the perennials? Is it better to plant them now or in the fall?
Well, that's the interesting question about that is that the time to find the perennials at the garden centers is when they're about to bloom. So if you want to put in a whole garden and want to have a variety of plants that have good seasonal interest, you often can't get them at the same time. But it's fine to go get your plants, your perennials down and put them in the ground. I mean, it gives them all summer to get established. And so that's generally a good time to do it now. I mean, you can often put them in the fall, but then you don't enjoy them. You might as well put them in now. And so like not all the plants, but a lot of the plants that'll be at the Garden Club plant sale tomorrow will have been divided perennials, and they're supposed to dig them up a couple weeks ahead of time so they get set in their pots and they get some roots. And so you can plant them right away as soon as you get them. So,
Great, thank you.
you're welcome.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Nope.
No? Maybe, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. And I learned a lot personally.
You're
And I'm
welcome.
definitely gonna have to watch this a couple more times. But thank you very much. This is very informative.
You're very welcome.
All right, take care. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.